Hey there, Mr. Mechnick, here to do a little podcast on carbohydrates. As you listen to the podcast, I think it's very important for you to consider questions that you have and also consider writing down important information. You probably don't have to write down everything that I say, but record important information that you think is relevant to the purpose of this presentation. So our focus today is going to be on carbohydrates. If we look at levels of organization within living things, we are basically at the level right here, the molecule level. So carbohydrates are also in a group of molecules that we call biomolecules because they are essential for living things. So as living things use carbohydrates, they're going to use it for cell processes, they're going to use it for growing and developing and maintaining homeostasis in living organisms. So it's a necessity for all living things within life. So to kind of backstep a little bit and to think about what a biomolecule is, it's an organic substance. Organic substances are molecules that contain carbon. So in this particular model right here, these red dots represent carbon atoms. And these things work really well for other substances to bond to. So they share their electrons very easily with hydrogen and oxygen atoms to form these group of molecules called biomolecules. Carbohydrates are called carbohydrates because they contain carbon and they also contain hydrogen and oxygen. And the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen will always be a 2-to-1 ratio. So that's important when you see a chemical formula, and if you see something like C6H12O6, you should understand that that is a carbohydrate. So we can divide carbohydrates up into three categories. One is called a monosaccharide, second is called a disaccharide, and the third is called a polysaccharide. So saccharide comes from the Latin word for sugar. So we are looking at one sugar molecules. We would classify these monosaccharides as simple sugars. And they all have the same exact chemical formula, C6H12O6. So if you look at the three structures of these three monosaccharides, you will notice that they are all slightly different. So even though they all have the same number of carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, and oxygen atoms, their structures are slightly different. So this particular glucose molecule has a hexagon shape for its central carbon ring. Galactose also has a hexagon shape for its central carbon ring. However, fructose has a pentagon, so we call this a pentose sugar. So glucose is again one of the simplest sugars, very essential for our cells to utilize. Fructose is a sugar that's derived from most fruits, and galactose is a simple sugar derived from milk. These are all considered monomers. These are the building blocks of all carbohydrates. So if we think about a monosaccharide joining together with another monosaccharide, mono plus mono gives us a polymer. So polymers are more than one monosaccharide joined together. So this particular diagram represents the process that links a monosaccharide to another monosaccharide. When this happens, you end up exchanging these OH atoms connecting to one of these hydrogen atoms. So those end up connecting together in a chemical reaction, and they're removed in the process. So as they are removed, they are actually producing H2O. So we call this a dehydration synthesis reaction simply because it's dehydrating or removing water as a result of two simple sugars joining together. So this is a very important process that happens in most autotrophic organisms or plants. So when these simple sugars join together, they can form another group of simple sugars that we call disaccharides. These are the common ones that many of us like to eat. We like to consume these. They taste good, and they're found in a lot of our drinks that we consume and a lot of the candies that we like to eat. So sucrose is probably the most common one. So sucrose is a double sugar. It's regular table sugar, and it has a chemical formula of C12H22O11. C6H12O11. So if we think about that formula, it's basically C6H12O6 plus C6H12O6, and then we have to subtract or dehydrate a water molecule from it to end up with a chemical formula of C12H22O11. Again, note the ratio of 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen remains true for a disaccharide. So these three types of disaccharides are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And these are a combination of the monosaccharides. So sucrose is built with glucose and fructose joining together. Lactose is built with a galactose molecule and a glucose molecule, and maltose is joined by 2 glucose molecules. So you may have heard of someone that is lactose intolerant. That just simply means that they have the inability to break apart this chemical bond that links galactose and glucose together. And as a result, they might get stomach aches and pains as a result of eating things with lactose sugar in it. So it requires a specific enzyme to break apart that particular bond to form galactose and glucose again. The third type of carbohydrate is called a polysaccharide. So poly simply means many, so it's many sugar molecules joined together. The chemical formulas for these can range from 600 in a chain, maybe down to 3 or 4 simple sugars in a chain. So this is the general formula where you can plug N, which is the number of monomers in the chain. So if it was 3, we could plug in 3 here, and that would describe how many water molecules are synthesized out of the reaction. So if you have 3 monomers joining together, we can see there would be a water molecule that's produced when they bond together right here, and there would be another water molecule that's synthesized out of the reaction when they join together here. So that's where we get the N-1 from. And then we could take that answer and subtract it from the number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the total reaction. So the 3 types of polysaccharides: glycogen, cellulose, and plant starch. Glycogen is a sugar that our bodies store simple sugars as. It's an animal starch, the complex sugar that our liver can store for long periods of time, and we can break it down if we don't have simple sugars available. Cellulose is probably one of the most abundant polysaccharides in the world because it makes up the plant cell walls in all plants. So anytime you eat plant matter, so if you have a salad, oats, grains, whatever you're eating, it contains lots and lots of cellulose, which is very important because it provides dietary fiber. And then the last one is plant starch. This is, again, a complex polysaccharide, which is made up of a lot of glucose molecules joined together. So for those of us that like eating breads and pastas and potatoes and different grains, you get loaded with lots and lots of plant starch, which are complex polysaccharides, which lots and lots of glucose molecules join together. So here's just an example of a complex starch molecule showing the linkage between each of these simple sugars to make this large complex chain. So it takes a little bit more energy, it takes a little bit more time for your body to actually digest a starch molecule. Cellulose is linked together with these specific linkages, and as a result, our bodies can't process and digest this. We don't secrete the necessary enzymes to break apart cellulose. So as a result, things that are rich in cellulose, our bodies don't digest. We don't get the energy from it. It passes through our digestive system as cellulose. So overall, if we think about the general role of carbohydrates, the biggest thing they all do is provide energy source for us, for living things. They're also useful in some living things to provide some structure. You know, in plants, they provide the structural basis for these cell walls in every single cell in a plant. We also find some structural components in our own cells, like our cell membranes actually have some carbohydrates in them for some integrity. So again, we find carbs everywhere. No matter where we look, we can find carbohydrates. They're in all the foods that we consume. You look at any food label, and it's going to tell you how many grams of carbohydrates are in that particular food that you are consuming. And one of the things that we are going to do in class is spend some time taking a variety of different types of foods and using chemical indicators to test for the presence of monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So plan on having some notes taken from this presentation, and then in class we are going to spend some time doing some chemical testing of different types of foods and see if we can categorize them into the correct category, mono, di, or poly. Thanks, and